Welcome to the MCAT Basics podcast, brought to you by the physicians at Med School Coach. Each week, Sam Smith breaks down high-yield MCAT topics so you can score as high as possible on test day.
Hello and welcome to Prospective Doctors MCAT Basics with your host Sam Smith. The goal of this podcast is to cover the highest yield topics on the MCAT and provide you with some sort of insight into the questions that the MCAT really likes to ask. This podcast covers personality, and I'm going to talk about two main topics here. I'm going to talk about personality theories of like where personality comes from and kind of what it is. And then I'll talk a little bit about personality disorders. And these are just conditions in which someone's personality or kind of an aspect of someone's personality affects their well-being. This material will show up on one of the four MCAT sections. That's the Psych-Soc section. Most of this is psychology. So I hope this helps in your studies. Enjoy. So before we get into the different theories of personality that you should know for the MCAT, I want to first talk about what personality is. How do we even define personality? Personally, when I hear the term personality, I kind of think about it as like someone's repeated behavior over time. Are they nice each time I see them? Well, then that person is a kind person. Or are they an asshole every time I see them? That person's an asshole then if they're that way every time I see them. I also kind of include like the quirks that people have when I talk to them. Maybe the way they talk or some of the mannerisms they have, that all ties into their personality. So, to me, personality is kind of like an all-encompassing term that describes someone's innate or learned behaviors. And of course, that's like my intuitive definition. The real definition, one given by the American Psychology Association, again, this is a real source, defines personality as, quote, individual differences in characteristic patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Another legit definition says that personality is, quote, a unique combination of patterns that influence behavior, thought, motivation, and emotion in a human being. So my intuitive sense of personality isn't super far off, and I'm sure yours isn't either. In the end, personality, in short, is what makes us us. And I know that sounds a little bit deep, but maybe that's a good way of just kind of thinking about what personality is. It's something that influences thinking, our feelings or our emotions, and our behavior. All right, so now I want to get on and talk a little bit about the different theories of personality. Now, as I go through these different theories, I want to have an example that I can use to kind of help explain some of these theories. So I'm going to describe the personality of one of the most controversial people of our time. Well, at least for the last 4 years. I'm talking about leader of the free world, Kanye West. Here's what others have said about his personality. And these are coming from Google. These are not coming from me. So if you get mad at any of these, don't be mad at me. Be mad at the internet. All right, so the first trait here is creativeness, right? Kanye's produced some of the greatest music in the world. He is very into fashion, and he's kind of this idea guy who's had all these crazy ideas. So we'll say he's creative. The second personality trait that came up a lot in reference to Kanye was narcissism, right? Nobody loves Kanye as much as Kanye does. At least that's what people say. And if you've ever heard him talk or listened to an interview with him, he definitely is not lacking in the self-confidence department. The next character trait is sensitivity. And the website that called him sensitive cited the fact that he enjoys reading poetry. Does that really make someone sensitive? Come on, this is 2021. Finally, the fourth and last character trait of Kanye West is perceptiveness. Apparently, he's pretty good at taking in a bunch of information from a bunch of different places and synthesizing his own opinions on it or synthesizing ideas from that. So keep Kanye in these four characteristics, creativeness, narcissism, sensitivity, and perceptiveness, in mind as I go through each of these different theories of personality. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to use each of these different theories to try to explain why Kanye West is the way he is. All right, so there are 6 different theories I'm going to go through here. Psychoanalytic theory, humanistic theory, trait theory, including the 5-factor model of personality, social cognitive theory, biological theory, and finally, behaviorist theory. And these are sometimes called perspectives on personality because they're kind of a way of looking at personality through a specific lens, say through the lens of psychoanalytic theory or through the lens of social cognitive theory. So just keep that in mind. These can also be called perspectives. I'll start with the psychoanalytic perspective or theory of personality. So this was developed by Sigmund Freud, and it states that human personality is composed of three elements: the id, the ego, and the superego. And basically, these three elements work together to produce our personality. So the id, that first component of personality that I mentioned, is a component of personality that's present from birth, and it's driven by pleasure, and it strives for immediate satisfaction. On the other hand, the ego kind of balances the id. According to Freud, quote, "The ego develops from the id and ensures that the impulses of the id can be expressed in a manner that is acceptable in the real world," end quote. So basically, the ego is the component of personality that deals with reality. At times, it has to suppress the id in order to maintain behavior that is socially acceptable. Finally, the superego is the last component of personality to develop, and it holds our sense of moral right and wrong. And Freud said that we developed our superego from watching our parents and watching others in society around us. So in short, the id is like the devil on your shoulder saying,
sex, drugs, sugar.
While your ego and your superego are on your other shoulder saying, hold up, let's think this through for a little bit here. What are the prospective consequences of said sex, drugs, and sugar? And Freud says that it's a balance of these different factors that then determines someone's personality. So let's take this lens and look at Kanye. Freud might say that Kanye's narcissism comes from an imbalance between the id and the ego. He might say that there's too much of that id that's getting through that the ego is not able to suppress. In fact, in Freud's 1914 essay called, quote, "On Narcissism," end quote, he introduces a term called ego ideal that's related to narcissism. Basically, the ego ideal is the inner image of oneself that one wants to become. It's like your goal person that you want to become. And Freud says that for people with a narcissistic personality or a narcissistic personality trait, they have an inflated sense of this ego ideal. They basically see themselves better than they are. And so that part of their ego is basically dysfunctional. This ego ideal part of the ego is dysfunctional, I should say. The next theory I want to talk about here is the humanistic theory or humanistic perspective on personality. This theory was developed by Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, and it says that personality stems from one's desire to achieve their individual potential. It focuses on psychological growth, free will, and personal awareness. Simply put, this theory says that a person's personality traits or a person's personality comes from their drive to become the person that they want to be. Let's go back to Kanye. So say growing up, Kanye was super inspired by other creative people before him, and he thinks to himself, hey, that's what I want to be. He sees his ideal self as someone who is extremely creative. So eventually then over time, he becomes what he desires most, to be a super creative person. And this theory also then would suggest that in some sense, he wants to be narcissistic. And that could make sense, right? Maybe he wants to be that type of person who is overly confident and boisterous and jumps up on stage and interrupts Taylor Swift at the 2009 VMAs.
Yo, Taylor, I'm really happy for you. I'm gonna let you finish. But Beyonce had one of the best videos of all time.
Maybe he thinks that in order to be successful in the music industry, he needs to act that way. And so then his ideal self is someone who is narcissistic. And who knows if that's the case? I'm just kind of making this up. But this theory, the humanistic perspective, would say that in a way Kanye wants to be narcissistic or sees his ideal self as someone who is narcissistic. Okay, the next theory I want to talk about is trait theory or trait perspective. And this says that personality is a series of traits that are stable over time. In other words, it says that personality is a bunch of traits that differ from person to person to person, but remain constant throughout a person's lifetime. And honestly, this is basically how I presented Kanye West to you earlier. I gave him 4 personality traits that I found on a Google search. Again, creative, narcissistic, sensitive, and perceptive. And that allowed you to kind of imagine him as a person and imagine his behavior from those traits. And this is how I typically think of personality, and I think probably you do too. Really, everyone does, is that personality consists of like these individual traits that a person has. You know, you can take those tests online that will tell you your personality traits from a series of questions or whatever. So I think that this is kind of almost the most popular perspective of personality. And again, trait perspective says that personality can be separated into individual traits that are stable throughout a person's lifetime. Now, there's one specific example of trait perspective that I want to bring up because it might show up on the MCAT, and that is the 5-factor model of personality. So this was created by Raymond Cattell, and it narrows personality down to 5 traits: openness, conscientiousness, which is like responsibility and planning, agreeableness, neuroticism, which is like insecurity and anxiety, and then extroversion. For the MCAT, I'd just be aware of those 5 different traits. You know, I could see it asking a question about which of the 5 personality traits from the 5-factor model does person X have in the passage, or, you know, do the test subjects have in this passage. The next theory I'm going to talk about is called social cognitive theory. This theory was developed by Albert Bandura and says that personality is developed through social learning and cognition, which is thinking and judging. Essentially, it says that personality is developed by watching and learning from others and then choosing to either emulate that behavior or to not emulate that behavior. And I think really the big thing here is the emphasis on the fact that someone can either choose to emulate the behavior or not. In his 1999 paper, Bandura makes it very clear that his theory is one that emphasizes personal agency. He says it's not like individuals have no control as to whether or not they're picking up certain personality traits that they see. Quote, in the agenic socio-cognitive view, people are self-organizing, proactive, self-reflective, and self-regulating, not just reactive organisms shaped and shepherded by external events. People have the power to influence their own actions and to produce certain results, end quote. Let's apply this view to Kanye's personality in the context of his sensitivity. The social cognitive theory might say that a loved one that he admired a lot, like maybe his dad, was sensitive, and that at a young age, Kanye decided to adopt that trait. So, you know, he saw his dad acting sensitive. I don't know, maybe his dad also liked poetry and likes romantic comedies and candles. And so Kanye recognizes this and says, wow, I really like this trait. I want to be like my dad. And he decides to emulate that behavior and emulate that trait. And thus, that is how he picks up his sensitive personality trait. Hopefully you noticed the 2 components there. The first being that Kanye saw this in his environment and he learned it. And secondly, he thought about it. He had some cognition. He said, do I like this? Do I not like this? Okay, I like it. I'm going to pick it up. Next is the biological theory or biological perspective of personality. The biological perspective of personality focuses on the role of biology, and specifically genetics, in explaining the forces that shape personality. Twin studies have shown that personality is somewhere around 40% heritable, meaning that a component of personality, in fact, does come from genetics. And what this reminds me of is this documentary about these 3 brothers who are all triplets, and they were all separated at birth. It's called 3 Identical Strangers. If you've never seen it, go watch it. Pretty interesting. But anyways, what was interesting about it is that these 3 triplets, which by the way are identical, so they share all the same genes, all have very similar personalities after they've been separated from birth. So each grew up in a completely different environment. One, I think, was like in a richer household. The other was in a much poorer household. But in the end, they all 3 had pretty similar personalities. So that just goes to show that there is some component of genetics that goes on to then determine personality. Further, to go back to Kanye, somebody who prescribes to this biological theory of personality would argue with somebody that had the social cognitive perspective that I just described. They would say, no, Kanye is not sensitive because he's watched his dad and then decided to internalize his dad's personality. Instead, it's some genetic thing that Kanye has inherited from his father, some sensitivity gene or something like that. Obviously, that doesn't exist, but for the sake of the argument, pretend there's a sensitivity gene. A person with the biological perspective would say that is why Kanye is sensitive. He inherited that gene from his father. Finally, the very last theory I want to mention here is the behaviorist theory. Now, the behaviorist theory says that a person's personality is determined by the environment around them. Basically, it says that personality traits are learned and then reinforced by an organism's environment. And this goes completely against the biological perspective. It says that traits are not biologically determined at all. An intro psychology textbook describes it this way. Quote, in fact, behaviorists believe that if they could perfectly control a person's environment, then they could impart any type of personality on any individual that they choose. End quote. So for the last time, let's take this perspective and use it to analyze Kanye West's narcissism. The behaviorist perspective would start out with the presumption that Kanye's environment throughout his life shaped his personality. The theory would suggest that his narcissistic personality was created through rewards and punishments that he was given as a kid and throughout his life. So let's say, for instance, when he was growing up, maybe his parents rewarded narcissistic behavior because, they liked it for whatever reason. And I'm making all this up, but let's just say that that's the case. And then as he continued to grow, he became this successful rapper. And whenever he acted haughty or narcissistic or boisterous, the media gave him more attention. And so that was another reward that then reinforced that narcissistic behavior. And so over time, the rewards and the fact that he didn't get punished for acting narcissistic led him to have that personality characteristic. So those are several perspectives or theories on personality. Make sure you know how to apply each one. Hopefully my Kanye example helped a little bit in that. The next thing I want to talk about here are personality disorders. Can't get into a hospital or doctor's office to do shadowing? Well, you're in luck. A fourth-year medical student and I just produced a virtual shadowing video series that is also a podcast. The idea here is to help pre-meds get some kind of clinical experience during the COVID-19 pandemic, since it's pretty hard to right now. I obviously have no idea how admissions committees are going to view this. I don't know what they're going to say if you put it on your med school application. But I imagine that it's only going to help and that it's better than nothing. Throughout the recording of the series, I learned a ton, and I think you would too. So if you're interested, search virtual shadowing in your podcast app or visit shadowing.medschoolcoach.com. Personality disorders are defined as strong deviations from how we expect someone to behave that leads to consequences for them. With that said, there are 10 different personality disorders I'm going to talk about, and they're separated into 3 main clusters or 3 main categories. The first category is odd or eccentric behavior. The second category is dramatic, emotional, or erratic behavior. And then the third category is anxious or fearful behavior. Cluster A, odd or eccentric behavior. There are 3 personality disorders that fall under this category or into this A cluster. Paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. Now, the definitions that I'm about to give you come from the Mayo Clinic. Paranoid personality disorder is defined as unrelenting mistrust and suspicion of others even when there's no reason to be suspicious. Next, schizoid personality disorder is described as a condition in which people avoid social activities and consistently shy away from interaction with others. And finally, schizotypal personality disorder is a condition in which people prefer to be alone and isolated and are uncomfortable being in relationships. And they sometimes might exhibit odd speech or behavior, and they have a limited or flat range of emotions. Harvard Medical School says that, quote, those with this disorder also tend to have markedly illogical thinking with unusual ideas or odd beliefs that are not consistent with prevailing ideas. For example, a strong belief in extrasensory perception, or ESP. They may report unusual perceptions or strange body experiences. Now, one thing I was a little bit curious about as I was going through these different personality disorders is how exactly are these different from schizophrenia, right? They sound very similar to it. Schizoid personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder. Is this the same thing as schizophrenia? And the answer is that it's not. There is some overlap between these three different conditions: schizophrenia, schizotypal, and schizoid personality disorders. However, in schizophrenia, patients exhibit psychotic and/or delusional behaviors and symptoms. So, in a great YouTube video, Dr. Ramini from MedCircle, who is a clinical psychologist, says that people with schizophrenia suffer from, quote, a true departure from reality, a sensory experience that no one else in a person's environment is experiencing, end quote. I'm lucky enough to be able to actually play for you some of the audio from this YouTube video. Thanks a ton to MedCircle for allowing me to do this. And again, this is Dr. Ramini talking about the difference between schizophrenia, schizotypal, and schizoid personality disorder.
In today's video, we're going to talk about the differences between schizoid personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and schizophrenia. Now, I have a problem just saying it. A lot of people have problems understanding between the three. Clear it up for us.
Well, I think it's the use of the word skits or skis and all three of them that throw people off. There is a genetic relationship between schizoid personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and schizophrenia. It has been suggested that these three disorders intersect in that having a first-degree relative with one of those disorders makes a person more likely to have any one of them. Now, the big ringer here is that a person who has schizophrenia, it has been established that they experience psychotic symptomatology. A psychotic symptom is either typically a hallucination or a delusion, a true departure from reality. Seeing something that other people don't see, hearing something other people don't hear, tasting it, smelling it, feeling it, but it's a sensory experience that no one else in that environment is experiencing. Or they're having a delusion, which is again a break from reality, a belief that is patently untrue that the person holds on to tightly. So those two symptoms, delusions, hallucinations, psychotic symptomatology, are not seen in schizotypal or schizoid personality disorder. You have a psychotic symptom, you either have schizophrenia or some other what we call psychotic spectrum disorder.
Got it.
Schizotypal personality disorder has some overlap with schizoid personality. There's a lot of restricted capacity to have normal social relationships and a relative disinterest, but people with schizotypal personality disorder are not indifferent to other people, and they're also not completely emotionally detached. In addition, people with schizotypal personality can have odd, at times peculiar, erratic sorts of behavior that would catch other people's attention. That is not sort of consistent with the rules of a given society.
Right.
So they may dress in a very strange way, they may make weird vocalizations, they typically can't hold steady employment, they seem unusual to other people. In schizoid personality is a personality type characterized by absolute disinterest in human relationship, absolute indifference to human relationship, and a complete emotional detachment. They can present as being very aloof. Their emotional state is very flat, but you may not see those sort of odd and unusual kinds of behaviors like you would see in schizotypal patterns.
Thanks again to medcircle.com for letting me use that audio. If you're interested in watching their videos, you can visit their website, medcircle.com, or look them up on YouTube. They do have some pretty good psychology content, so go check them out. Before I go on to the next cluster of personality disorders, I just want to give you like a one-sentence summary of each of these three disorders again and kind of summarize them. Paranoid personality disorder is a disorder in which a person is so suspicious and untrusting of others that they can't maintain personal relationships. Schizoid personality disorder is when a person is avoiding people just because they don't see a point in sharing their time with others. They're basically extremely antisocial. Schizotypal personality disorder is when a person avoids people because they like to be alone. And they also exhibit this weird or eccentric behavior that can turn into being paranoid and untrusting of other people. So it seems like this one is a little bit of a combination of both of the other two. Cluster B, dramatic, emotional, or erratic behavior. Cluster B contains 4 different personality disorders that you should know: narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and histrionic personality disorder. Narcissistic personality disorder is an inflated sense of oneself. I obviously talked quite a bit about that earlier, but just know if someone's narcissism gets in the way of, their everyday life or their personal relationships, it can be considered a personality disorder. People with antisocial personality disorder tend to, quote, lie, break laws, act impulsively, and lack regard for their own safety or for the safety of others, end quote. In some cases, antisocial personality disorder is synonymous with sociopathy or people who are sociopaths. Next, borderline personality disorder is characterized by swings in mood, self-image, and behavior. The NIH says that people with borderline personality disorder may experience intense episodes of anger, depression, and anxiety that can last from a few hours to days. Finally, histrionic personality disorder is a pattern of excessive attention-seeking behaviors, which include an excessive desire for approval. The note card version of these cluster B disorders are as follows. Narcissistic personality disorder is when someone loves themselves a lot. Antisocial personality disorder is when someone's a sociopath. Borderline personality disorder is mood and behavior swings that are similar to bipolar disorder. And histrionic personality disorder is when someone is very attention-seeking. Cluster C, anxious and fearful behavior. Within Cluster C, there are 3 different disorders to know: avoidant personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. Avoidant personality disorder is when someone avoids other people because they are overly afraid of being rejected by those people. Dependent personality disorder is when a person is very dependent on others all the time, and then without that person or persons that the person is dependent upon, they can't live their life. Finally, obsessive-compulsive personality disorder is when a person is so focused on being orderly and perfect and in control that it affects their life in a negative way. And by the way, this is not the same as obsessive-compulsive disorder or OCD. As the guy in the Khan Academy video says, OCD involves tic-like compulsions, like walking in a certain pattern over and over, or repeatedly checking the locks on your door all day, just some type of behavior that's repeated over and over. Obsessive-compulsive personality disorder does not include those tic-like compulsions. So if you want to think about it this way, think about it this way. OCD equals repetitive compulsions. Obsessive-compulsive personality disorder does not. Again, here's the flashcard version of each of those. Avoidant personality disorder is when people avoid others because they're afraid of rejection. Dependent personality disorder is someone who is very dependent on others. And finally, obsessive-compulsive personality disorder is when a person is so focused on being orderly and perfect and in control that it affects her life poorly. The very last thing I'll say here is that there is some overlap between these different clusters. It's not like people have, just the cluster A conditions and nothing from cluster B or nothing from cluster C. You can have a condition, from A and one from B and one from C in a single person. Further, a lot of symptoms from these different categories and from these different clusters overlap. So just keep that in mind that, these are not these nice, neat categories that everybody fits inside. Someone can have kind of a mix of some of the different conditions from the different clusters. All right, so that is it for the Personality Podcast. As always, if you like what we do, please go give us a review on iTunes. It helps in the rankings, and it helps us reach more students. As well as, tell your friends or your cousins or your family members that are studying for the MCAT that there is this free resource out there that they can use to study. And good luck to those of you who are taking the MCAT soon. I have heard that they are canceling tests, so that's shitty, but just keep studying hard, and hopefully once everything opens back up, you can take it, kill it, and then get into med school.
At Med School Coach, we know that studying for the MCAT exam can be challenging, especially for busy students on the go. That's why our team created MCAT Prep, the only all-encompassing study app built specifically for the MCAT. MCAT Prep by Med School Coach provides student access to extremely high-quality content and a personalized curriculum for free. The app has more than 250 videos, 1,000 flashcards, and 1,000 unique MCAT questions. Plus, MCAT Prep by Med School Coach allows students to create a personalized study schedule and track progress over time. You need every competitive advantage you can get to get into medical school, and now you can put the experts from Med School Coach into your pocket. It's the closest pre-med students can come to a personal tutor without spending a penny. Download MCAT Prep by Med School Coach for free at medschoolcoach.com/MCAT. Or download it directly from the Apple Store or Google Play Store. You can achieve your medical school dreams, and MCAT Prep by Med School Coach can help.
Each episode of MCAT Basics is brought to you by Med School Coach. To access Med School Coach services, including MCAT tutoring and medical school admissions advising, visit our website at medschoolcoach.com. Good luck as you prepare for the MCAT, and we hope you tune in again next time.